Ladies and gentlemen, let me say heartily welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming on this evening of a longer weekend. I'm very grateful that you came, and I think it can become a very interesting evening. I do not want to mention too many official guests. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Ernst Huber. He's a board member, and he was ready also to moderate because up to 1 day ago, I was not sure that I could come, and insofar he was ready to moderate on my behalf. Thank you very much, Ernst. It's also a great pleasure to have Dr. Peter Eider. We cooperate very much, and it's a special pleasure also to have here Kurt Seinitz, the doyen of the Austrian journalists, especially in international affairs. Yeah, and of course we do not want to talk too long before, because we have a very rare speaker today, and we would like to use it. It is a more or less unique opportunity to have somebody who really comes from the inside of the system, who knows the inside of the system, who is a specialist not only for politics, but also for economy and for energy. And all those three questions, of course, are playing a very big role at the moment, and probably also for the coming years. And insofar, I just want to say a few words about his CV. Yeah, Vladimir Milov will celebrate his 50th birthday in 3 weeks. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. He was born not in the center of Russia, but in a smaller town in Komarov. This is in southwestern Siberia, but of course already in very young years he came to Moscow, as it was usual, and he studied mining at the mining university in Moscow. And afterwards he made a very steep career. Already at the age of 27 or 28, I guess, he was the head of the strategy department of the Federal Energy Commission of Russia. And after that, he became advisor. To the energy minister, and after that, he became the deputy energy minister himself. He made a lot of reform concepts for the energy system in Russia, but of course, there were big discussions, and Putin decided in a different way, and insofar this also changed his career. But of course, he did stay with the matters. He became the founder and the president of the Institute of Energy Policy, a leading independent Russian energy policy think tank, and engaged himself also in politics in different parties, Solidarność and so on. Maybe you tell us a little bit more about it. He has published a lot of books, some of them also together with Boris Nemtsov, and he became a senior advisor for Alexei Navalny in economy, and especially also for all the questions of energy. Yeah. At the moment, he is living in Vilnius, as far as I know. Maybe this is a little bit more safe, the place for you. And he became also a research associate to the Wilfried Martens Center in Brussels, where I have the honor to be the head of the academic council, and where we met just the other day. And this also brought him over here. So thank you very much, Mr. Former Minister. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And we tried to do this very informally, just start, give us your presentation, the way you are looking at the situation in Russia at the moment. What are your fears? What are your visions? What are your expectations? And then after that, we very shortly should go into a discussion and into question and answers, if this is okay. Yeah? Please,
thank you.
Mr. Milov.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and many thanks for having me, although in the very difficult times. There's so much to talk about, but I will try to make my remarks as condensed as possible to leave more room for discussion and questions. I'm sure there will be many. I think, to make some general points, what we are seeing right now is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is an attempt by Vladimir Putin to redraw global order. About 20 years ago, I read an article in the magazine Russian Global Affairs, which became increasingly pro-imperialist and chauvinist in the recent years, written by Slava Nikonov, one of the main ideological folks from Putin's camp, a member of parliament, and by the way, the grandson of Molotov, the same Molotov who signed the pact, the infamous pact with Ribbentrop. This article was called Back to Concert, meaning a concert of nations of the 19th century as the ideal model of international relations, as opposed to liberal rule-based order. So just a handful of powerhouses deciding the fate of the world, exclusive zones of influence, a redrawing border by force. That was said out in the open. It was even published openly 20 years ago. Not many people took this stuff seriously at the time being. I think we now probably realize that this was a mistake. And I think also it's important to understand that it's not just about Ukraine as such, what is happening. It's something bigger because Putin was always in different ways stating that a reconstruction of a major Russian zone of influence, which has become loosely known as Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is, by the way, not only limited to former Soviet borders, essentially evolved into being a major geopolitical idea and a major idea for domestic politics to sell to the Russian population over 20 plus years in power of Putin. So that is important. His major idea of domestic and international politics, which increasingly are one, they are very much intertwined, hardly separated in Putin's mindset, became dominance over some, exclusive sphere of influence, essentially, again, wherever Putin may reach, not only limited to former Soviet borders, but Western Balkans, for example, or like we can go further. If for those of you who happen to, do this unfortunate thing of watching Russian television these days, they really discuss projecting their influence well beyond the borders of the former Soviet republics. But there was always one problem, because you cannot say you dominate the former Soviet or communist space if you do not dominate Ukraine. Because Ukraine obviously is the biggest, most powerful of all these countries except for Russia itself. And looking at what's happening right now, I can't help but recall my experience when I used to work in the government 20 years ago. My inner Sherlock Holmes tells me that, listen, something clicks here. Because when I was working at the Federal Energy Commission, the Energy Ministry, I was always familiarized with minutes of Putin's meetings with major international leaders. Bush, Blair, Prodi, who was there, Schroeder, and so on. And it was always like, at the time I probably didn't notice this too much, but I do recall it now. if you go through all that papers, through all that minutes of different meetings, it was all Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 20 years ago. Ukraine this, Ukraine that. We're discussing transfer of control over Ukrainian gas pipeline network to Gazprom. Russian oil companies are buying Ukrainian refineries. We want to establish a common space, common market with Ukraine, whatever. You could see a clear fixation on the Ukrainian issue, which did not emerge just recently. It was heavily present back then, long ago. It was not exclusively Putin's idea, because there's this guy who was well known as a major reformer of Russia in the 90s, Anatoly Chubais, the author of Privatization of the 90s. In 2003, in the wake of Russia's parliamentary election campaign, he wrote an article, or was it a speech, but nonetheless, it was called nothing else than Liberal Empire. Liberal Empire. Chubais argued that Russia should establish control over strategic assets in the countries neighboring ourselves, and through that project its influence. Chubais made it look like this was a force for good, like Russia would be a democratic country and project democratic and liberal sort of influence. However, in reality, they really went on buying many strategic assets, investing in many oligarchs, politicians across the board, across our neighboring regions. But however, they changed the sign from plus to minus, from good to evil, from liberal to essentially, sorry, I'm just quoting one of the recent New York Times articles. The headline was, "Russia is fascist and we should say it." So there was the very same concept of Chubais' liberal empire coming to life, but with a totally different sign. So I think we should really look at the systemic nature of events that were happening. It was all in the making for quite some time. Disrespect for international liberal rule-based order. Putin's war that was launched on the 24th of February was by far not at all the first example of that, of a total disrespect for international rules. Putin and his government, they have been throwing their international legal liabilities into dustbin at will, multiple times. Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk agreements are just a couple of examples on surface. So I think what we are seeing right now is a culmination of attempts of redrawing global order, restoring the principle of might makes right, normalization of redrawing borders and establishing zones of influence by force. What we're seeing right now in Ukraine is a culmination of that. And there were many, many early warning signs coming before. We can remember, I'm sure, you know, plenty of these things. So I think I listened to many commentators, politicians, experts in the Western world who are saying that, listen, for the sake of peace, we need to get into some sort of agreement with Putin, sort of give him what he wants. I have a big question to these people, which is actually, are you really sure that when he receives something from the Western world, after brutally attacking a neighboring country by force, that he will stop? That he will not be encouraged by the fact that he tried to break the rule-based order and brutally attack a neighboring country, and was rewarded with some concessions, something like that. Won't it stimulate him to go further? I think there is no other way but to positively answer this question, which I think all these debates about potential agreement given away some Ukrainian territory, internationally recognized. It's not even naive, it's beyond naive. It's pretty cynical. I think this whole concept doesn't hold water because Putin is aiming at not just some parts of the territory of Ukraine. He's aiming at redrawing the global order, nothing less. And that's important to understand. We'll be happy to have a further debate on this. But I think what is also important to understand is that after 3 months of the war, we can clearly see that Putin's system is overstretched. He took too much weight with this invasion, which he cannot really handle. You see that his army is not coping with this conflict, which was pretty visible. And when this war started, I was in the United States with a lot of well-known experts. Like, we were arguing between themselves because many of them repeated what the press had said, referring to the US intelligence, like Kyiv is going to fall within 96 hours. I said, no, this is not going to be the case. I have actually commented on all these issues months before the war and highlighted publicly on record the vulnerabilities of the Russian army, the underestimation of Ukrainian resistance, and many other important factors. Another issue, we can clearly see what a significant impact sanctions are having on Russia. I think that's a very unique example of a deglobalization of a major economy that has not happened before on that scale. Because countries like Iran or North Korea, they are not nearly as important as participants of the international markets and division of labor as Russia is. And it's being very severely cut off, and cut off for a prolonged period of time. I think it's clear that there will be no return to normality, at least as long as the current regime is in power in Russia. It's not just about the sanctions that are imposed by the Western governments. I think probably even bigger impact is happening because of the withdrawal of international companies from doing business with Russia, participating in Russia's projects. That is having a tremendous effect, which we are yet to measure, and it's hard to measure with statistics. Statistics doesn't show it because, for instance, just a relatively minor issue of supply of heat exchangers for a major Arctic LNG project by Novatek, by Linde, German company, which had withdrawn from the project since the war began. This heat exchanger issue can bring the whole big LNG project to a halt because there is no replacement. You can't manufacture them in China and elsewhere. By the way, you see that Chinese companies and banks themselves are, voluntarily also withdrawing from many projects with Russians, because on one hand they see a lot of risks with Russia's exposure to international sanctions, and on the other hand, Russia is enormously losing attractiveness as an opportunity. This deeply troubled economy is not so attractive for Chinese or Indian or other partners anymore as it was just several months ago. So we'll be happy to talk more about the effect of sanctions, which will become visible gradually, because right now we still have significant oil and gas revenues, which will shrink. We still have some projects continuing to operate for some additional months because the withdrawal of Western companies will also be gradual. We see some warehouses and stockpiles still not completely depleted. But further down the road, we'll see more disruptive effects, and Russian economy will find itself in a bigger trouble. To sum up, I think the major impact of sanctions will be extreme loss of a quality of life for the Russian people. We can see it happening already on many fronts, like just a very recent opinion poll research have shown that Russians are confirming a very significant deterioration of the quality of food that is available in grocery stores. The other issue, for instance, is that Aeroflot, our flagship air carrier, is about to begin cannibalizing its own fleet using Boeing and Airbus aircraft for spare parts, because spare parts are no longer available at the international market anymore. And actually, you just need to Google, like, deficit of spare parts, deficit of server capacity for digital infrastructure, deficit of seed bank for agriculture and harvesting, whatever. I can go on for hours. All this will have significant disruptive effects, and there has been a lot of hopes among the Russian elite that we might refocus on Asia and actually divert ourselves away from Europe. Like, okay, if Europe imposes oil embargo, then we will sell everything to China and India. It's not so easy. It's easier said than done. Because, and I think it's worth reading for those of you who haven't seen it. I produced a big research paper for the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies in November about the failing Russia-China economic partnership, which was announced as a big thing 8 years ago in 2014, when the rift with the West began because of the first stage of invasion of Ukraine. Putin then announced that, okay, problems with the West, we're going to turn to China and forge a great economic partnership with them. So actually what I did in this paper, again, I suggest it's worth reading, is that I did a cross-check of all the ambitious economic agenda and various projects that were announced in 2014. Bottom line, about 80% of them never went anywhere, because there is significant lack of economic gravity between Russia and China. We're separated. Most of Russia's economic activity is concentrated in the European part of the country, including the oil and gas production. Western Siberia is still Europe, and it's bound to European market. To reach Asian oil and gas markets, we would need to build totally new infrastructure, which will be several times more expensive than what we spent in the past few decades to build infrastructure connecting us to the European market. Because we're separated with all these vast distances, mountains, and so on. Like, for instance, when I talk to oil industry guys, and this happened even years before, and I said to them, what do you think about increasing oil exports to India? They say, look, our major export directions are Baltic and Black Sea ports, which are relatively shallow. They can't really handle super tankers, can only handle smaller tankers. And to export oil from the Baltic Sea to India, you need to go Danish Straits, Gibraltar, Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb Strait. All the shippers and insurers, they simply go crazy about all these routes, saying, can you please show us something simpler than that? So it's difficult. The costs are significantly higher. The costs of diverting oil and gas flows to China and India will be significantly higher. And also Chinese and Indians are extremely pragmatic people. They obviously are well aware of the trouble that Russia is finding itself in. So if you just simply browse the headlines about all this stuff, you see China demands discounts. India demands discounts. April data, I think the May data would be even worse, but April data shows that the average price of the Urals crude, the main Russian oil export crude, was $70 per barrel. And the average price of Brent crude was $105. So $35 per barrel price differential. And I think it's going to worsen further. So we're going to receive less money, and it's going to cost us more, which means that, okay, we can technically divert some stuff to Asia, but it's going to bring significantly less profits from oil and gas exports. So it's not going to work to the extent that many people are discussing in the media. So bottom line, we'll be happy to discuss this further, but sanctions are working. And generally, I think the whole Putin system was not designed to withstand this level of economic pressure and disconnect from global markets, financial system, technologies, logistics, and so on. I think really many experts are pointing out that we're really sliding somewhere back to the level of 1980s in terms of the modernity of technologies and production, in terms of living standards and so on. That will have significant impact on the public opinion. Not yet, because it's a gradual process, but public opinion also is significantly shifting. You heard a lot of headlines that majority of Russians, 70, 80% support Putin's invasion, which is, I wouldn't say that it's completely untrue, but there's a lot of nuance to what is happening in Russia domestically, because point number one, many people in the West have absolutely no idea what kind of propaganda and disinformation bubble Russians are living in. Majority of the country is totally disconnected from the truthful information. Also, it's important that for those of you who are interested, I can send you some links to my detailed articles in English analyzing Russian public opinion polling. But point number one, there's very little awareness of what is going on in Ukraine. Like Levada poll says that the number of Russians who say they closely follow the events in Ukraine is less than 30%. Which means that point number one, I think it's not fair to mention 70, 80% support figure without mentioning the other one, that not that many people are closely watching what's going on. Russians in the past decade, they have used to having some sort of a background war somewhere. Donbass, Syria, Georgia, and so on. We were always at war with somebody, so the fact that we have another war before people see the consequences does not really produce a major public opinion change immediately. But the public opinion change is also there, because what we have right now is like end April polling data, which is drastically different from what we saw in March. Support for what Putin is doing in Ukraine is visibly declining. I would say even sharply declining. Trust towards state television is also declining in big numbers. People are shifting towards social media as the major source of alternative information to state propaganda. Russian YouTube, that's a very important point, is still over 3 months of Putin's war against Ukraine, it is still not blocked. I'll be happy to tell you more about that, but bottom line is that there are very significant constraining factors for Putin regarding domestic public opinion. He cannot afford everything. Some things will backfire, will be painful, because over 100 million of Russians are using YouTube regularly for entertainment purposes mainly. And YouTube refuses to take down individual videos, you can only shut it down as a whole, and that will be a terribly unpopular move, which is why the Russian government is forced to tolerate whatever we are saying. My colleagues in the opposition, I think we are very much successful in reaching out to the Russian audience in the past few weeks and months. Like in March this year, the audience of Navalny Live YouTube channel, where I have regular broadcasts, exceeded 20 million people, unique viewers per month. Over 90% of them are from Russia. That is about 1/6 of the total adult population, and I would dare say about half of the politically active population which pays attention to politics. So our broadcasting that we do from abroad, but still we are Russian citizens speaking for the Russians, that bears fruit and also influences a change in public opinion. So what happens to the citizens of my country is that they only gradually begin to realize what is actually really going on. When many people learn, they are obviously terrified. Of course, I wouldn't argue with the fact that there is a significant part of the population which is infested with this Putin's neo-imperialist fever, which is very anti-Western, which does not have any empathy towards Ukraine and Ukrainians at all. I would agree, there's a significant part of the population which shares that views, but definitely not a majority. And there is a very big part of the Russian people who are simply unaware of what's going on. They lack truthful information. This is actually what we are right now mostly focused on and committed on doing, is fundamentally changing Russian public perceptions about Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine. I think it's a very important task which I call opening a third front against Putin. The first front happening on the battlefields of Ukraine and Ukrainian resistance, the second front being sanctions, the third front being the change of public opinion in Russia. My assessment is that Putin's system will not be able to withstand all this pressure. I think it's counterproductive to try to draw scenarios for how the situation will evolve because, let me tell you this, I'm a mechanical engineer by training. It is an extremely difficult thing to diagnose fatigue cracks in a big, complicated mechanism. Particularly a very closed mechanism, which we don't have access to what's going on. One specific warning, as a person who worked for 6 years in the Russian government and who knows many persons who are still out there with some sources inside the government, most of what you hear about what's going on inside the Kremlin, inside the Russian government, is not true. Most of what you hear is not true. About Putin's cancer, about people plotting to overthrow him, that is not true. Again, we'll be happy to elaborate. But so what I'm saying is that this is actually a very closed environment, and it became more closed recently because people, the insiders, are simply afraid to talk. They're really afraid to talk, to say something crossing the red lines, and that they will talk to some undesired persons and will be punished for that. So we don't know what happens inside this big mechanism. But it suffered such a big structural damage from the military losses in Ukraine, from Western sanctions. So my personal assessment is that it won't be able to withstand it. It will crack at some point. We do not know how and when, but I think for all the people who hold dear the liberal international rule-based order, sovereignty and decency of Russia's neighboring countries, including Ukraine in the first place, for all the people who hold dear precious human life, there's terrible suffering and terrible loss of life going on in Ukraine by now in this unprovoked war. It is important for all the people of the free world to actually double down on any possible efforts which will make life harder for Putin's regime and bring these fatigue cracks in the system closer. I would strongly advise against, drawing the scenarios, the exact scenarios about how this will happen. We do not know. I personally compare the current period in Russian history with 1983-84, the post-Brezhnev period, Andropov, Chernenko, and so on, when there were pretty dark years, when we were really living in fear of outbreak of a major nuclear conflict with the West, when repressions had intensified, particularly since Andropov took power. And back then, in 83, 84, if you would say to anybody, like it's important, in 1984, not the Orwellian 1984, but Chernenko's 1984, one of the last years of the Soviet Union, we had, don't laugh, elections. Last totally not free and not fair Soviet elections into Soviet parliament, Верховный Совет СССР. And the result was like, we go back to the issue of opinion polls and how many people support Putin. In 1984, the result of elections was like 99.9% for the Communist Party, like unanimity. Several years down the road, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people across the country were on the street demanding Communist Party gone. It just happened within a very few years framework. In 1984, if anybody told us that this would happen just few years afterwards, anyone would say, you're crazy. So it may seem right now. But really knowing a lot about what is happening inside the country at the moment, we can see that some part of the society is mobilized by television, by propaganda. It's also very visible because it's being amplified. It resonates with state propaganda, so it makes it look like there's a majority. There's not a pro-war majority. The country is learning with shock and terror about what is really happening. That is a very gradual process. We try to contribute to this as fast as we can. Economic troubles will also bring very significant changes to public opinion. Now, bottom line, I will conclude with this. Sometime further down the road, maybe before the end of the year, we will see both the Russian public and the Russian nomenclatura openly questioning what Putin is doing. Where do we go from here? What's the purpose of this whole thing? Maybe we should rethink our policy, rethink the war, rethink what Putin has been doing. Me and my colleagues, we believe that this will eventually happen, so we should really contributing to stopping what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Again, it's not just about Ukraine. If he is allowed to continue in Ukraine, he will not stop. He will go well beyond. He should be stopped, and sanctions are very effective in this regard. They are working, but we need more. Ukrainian resistance is extremely impressive. Ukrainian people are extremely brave and courageous, and they are the main factor that gives us hope at the moment that Putin's totalitarian onslaught will be defeated. But it's possible, and I think eventually it will happen, that we open a third front, domestic front inside Russia. It's already working. We are, I think, quite successful in that. It takes time, but I think the figures already shown that the collapse in public approval is remarkable. We're going to double down on it, and we believe that at the end of the day we'll be successful. There's so much to talk about. I don't want to go into really very lengthy introductory speech, so I'll probably stop here, and we'll be happy to take your questions and listen to your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Milov, thank you very much for your presentation, and I think everybody could feel that it was not just a theoretical presentation, but that you are not only an insider, but living with the development of Russia and also the inner substance. Okay, we have, of course, a lot of questions, and the first one will be Dr. Seinitz.
I want to continue your how will the regime end? Coup d'etat,
military regime, revolution? What's the...
Short answer is we don't know. And again, my approach is that it's really very hard to predict, so probably we shouldn't bother predicting it, but we should try to do everything possible to weaken it and to create a pretext, because weak regime would collapse one way or another. So the task is to weaken it right now. Now, a few things. First, I do not believe in any sort of coup d'etat for several reasons. Point number one. Putin's been systemically getting rid, over more than 20 years in power, of any kind of potentially challenging figures. Ministers, charismatic politicians, regional governors, they're all gone. He's surrounded by a technocratic yes men and yes women. Point number two. This is what I keep hearing when I talk to my former colleagues who are still working there inside the system. They say, listen, we are panically afraid to even speak between ourselves because there's a predominant chance that we will be recorded and the recording will be brought to Putin's table. So even like a discussion of these things that Putin is doing something bad and we need to get rid of him, even in one-on-one meetings, is pretty challenging. People are afraid to discuss this because they don't know who is listening, right? Discussion of this stuff in meetings involving like 4, 5, 6 or more people is impossible because you never know who's going to snitch on them and report to Putin, right? So this is not, all this talk about coup d'etat is extremely hypothetical because in practice they're simply afraid to even think about this, because FSB might scan their mind, you know, and report to Putin. The problem number three is that military, security, and paramilitary agencies are extremely divided. There's bitter rivalry between them. And it's very hard to imagine circumstances when they will be coming together, particularly for such a challenging task. And if they do not come together, and the manpower is significantly divided between the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Interior, the National Guard, plus, very important, something which is often missing from that coup d'etat analysis. Putin has established a very powerful separate service called Presidential Guard, Федеральная служба охраны, Federal Guard Service. About 50,000 personnel, extremely well paid, and they are they're specifically motivated to guard the president regardless of what. Nuclear war, whatever. They are specifically paid to guard the president. Important point. You probably remember the August 91 coup d'etat when Gorbachev was cut off from communications. Now, communications are no longer, not the presidential communication, but the whole secret government communications are no longer controlled by FSB, the successor of KGB. No longer. In 91, it was part of KGB. Not now. Communications are controlled by Presidential Guard. That's important. No minister or general who want to overthrow him can cut him off communications. Moreover, Putin controls communications, not them. He can cut them off. That is so. There are many. I would even say this is all important. But if you ask my opinion, what is probably more important is that in the current situation, to overthrow Putin and assume power, saying I'm the ruler now, or a collective ruling committee, whatever, it will be such a challenging task. We are in such a mess that you got to be like Winston Churchill plus to handle this stuff. There are no Winston Churchills there. So I think what I hear is that people, the very high positions, they go like, wow, we're in such a mess. Who is going to fix it? Definitely, they would prefer to sort of abstain because there is no line of heroes who want to take charge. of fixing this whole mess that Putin created. So I don't believe in coup d'etat. I also think that the Russian military is been not only specifically depoliticized in the past decades, but also it is effectively taken over by the FSB. If you take a look at like deputy ministers, people infiltrated in the chiefs of staff, and so on, there are many FSB ambassadors who effectively control with tentacles, you know. Yes, right. So, when you go in practical terms, it's really very, very hard to imagine something like this happening. So, what my scenario is that Putin's authority will begin to eventually decline, probably fast, when he will begin to be questioned by his own nomenclatura and the society about the direction where things are going, and nothing will happen. So people will see that it's possible to question him more. Remarkable feature of the present week is that some important political figures have openly started to talk about consequences of what they call a special military operation. Kaliningrad governor, there was a famous spat between Putin and Kaliningrad governor Alikhanov, who said, special operation ruined all our logistics in Kaliningrad region. And Putin interfered and said, you shouldn't say that. This has nothing to do with special operation. Next day, transport minister and the former CEO of Aeroflot Savelyev visits Astrakhan, the main Russian city on the Caspian Sea, talking about developing a north-south corridor from Baltic to the Caspian, and openly says on record that our logistics has been ruined because of sanctions. These are just, I mean, early signs. There will be more in the coming years. Once this becomes commonplace, that everything is ruined and people openly talk about it, then Putin's authority will go down, and I think even the society will feel that it's okay now to openly question what the government is doing. That was what was happening in mid-80s, because Gorbachev started perestroika not out of nothing. Soviet government has lost authority to that extent. So, like, I remember I was a school kid. Everybody in school in Moscow and all the parents, all the people I saw, they were speaking extremely negatively of the Soviet government. By early 1985, the authority was like totally lost. People lost faith in a communist system that it can move forward and fix things. So I think perestroika was not just the invention of Gorbachev, it was also because they knew. It was also the response to this, you know, public demand. So I think we're moving somewhere in that direction, but I would refrain from making very specific predictions of how and particularly when this regime might collapse.
Thank you. Yeah, we have.
Thanks for the fabulous speech. I wanted to ask 1.5 questions about the energy sector. First of all, since you have been involved in that sort of department of the Russian government back in the days, like 20 years ago, when most of the major plans in exporting gas and oil through pipelines came to Europe and advanced in that sense, which kind of, I would say, power was already back then in Russia's mind in regards to we can actually project power through the dependence of European states because of our gas and oil. And also we had a pipeline project which fell through a few years ago. That was Nabucco. And I would be interested what Russia's thoughts were back in the day when this was announced, and what Russia did in order to make it fail, if you know that.
Well, I have to say, it's hard to believe that, but I remember that very well. 20 years ago, opinions within the Russian elite were divided, I would say roughly in half. There were some people who wanted to talk about projecting influence, creating some exclusive zone of dominance and so on. There were others, and they were very influential, very loud, who said, listen, We need to drop that thing. We need to build common market, common space. Russian neighboring countries, I mean, let them integrate into the EU. This is where we should be going. I even heard from people like federal ministers, deputy prime ministers, I even heard 20 years ago words like, it's good that Central and Eastern European countries are joining NATO, because they will receive signed and sealed paper that they are protected now, and maybe they will stop hating us and we're going to build a common market. So actually 20 years ago, there was a competition between the two visions inside Russian power. What happened is that Putin had completely squeezed out and silenced all the people from the positive integration camp. He only fueled the imperialist aspirations. So this is why, speaking about pipelines, we had a very open argument inside the government, and no small number of officials, including myself, were saying, listen, the best way to go for us in terms of expanding our capacities to supply gas to Europe is enhancing and modernizing the Ukrainian transit network, because it's relatively cheaper than building all these insane, overly costly bypassing pipelines. Ukraine is a reliable partner, despite all this Kremlin talk about Ukraine stealing transit gas. There was never ever a case when Gazprom managed to prove in court that 1 single cubic meter was stolen. Ukraine, before 2005, Ukraine also provided us with the cheapest transit tariffs ever. You can just go, I mean, Energy Charter Secretariat has been doing regular papers and comparisons of gas transit tariffs in various European countries, and Ukraine was always the cheapest option. So there was, and we did this, we discussed this with the Prodi Commission and with Loyola de Palacio, the energy commissioner, that we simply need to jointly invest about 5 billion euros in upgrading of Ukrainian transit network, and it will be the best way to export Russian gas. More volumes, all the volumes that Europe needs and we need for revenue. But there were others who said that Ukraine is bad because it doesn't want to give up control over its transit network. So as long as it does not give up control, we need to build bypassing pipelines to force it to give up control. And if it still doesn't give up control, then we need to seize transit and ship the gas through Baltic Sea, Black Sea, whatever, right? So there were two schools of thought. You obviously know which one. Speaking about Nabucco, obviously the second, the imperialist school of thought, they were always against any sort of alternative pipelines that were not linked with Russia and delivered alternative sources of gas to European market bypassing Russia. Now, we were pretty much okay with it because to folks like myself and some other colleagues, the key issue was Russia's own competitiveness. Like, if we produce a competitive product, we will be able to sell it, no matter which pipelines you build through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, whatever. I mean, let them be. The origins of our success is ourselves making a competitive product. But the other school of thought said, listen, we got to block all the attempts and establish a monopoly. That's monopoly versus competition. That's essentially the ideology. This is why I left the government, because I understood that there's no room for my ideas, which was competition is always better than monopolism. Putin's vision and the vision of people who prevailed in this rivalry was that we need to establish a monopoly and we need to stem big rents, super profits from, monopolistic situation on the market. That was the origin of the... So unfortunately, that second school of thought, Putin's school of thought, imperialist school of thought, prevailed, also in the energy sector. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. The two neighbors. Yeah, short questions, please. Yeah, yeah.
If you could just shortly talk about the Kremlin's perception of the Chinese, and specifically,
A little bit louder.
if you could
Chinese,
just shortly talk about the Kremlin's perception of the Chinese, specifically the Chinese Communist Party, and do you think the Chinese and the Russians will come together in a sort of, Xi Jinping announced a few weeks back, the Global Security Initiative, a sort of Warsaw Pact 2.0. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we take the second.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that the sanctions hitting Russia have been very effective. Now, in your opinion, which one would you say is the most efficient of all the sanctions ongoing at the moment? Thank you very much.
I'll start with the second question. I would advise against cherry picking on this, the most powerful. Now, obviously, one of the game changers was freezing the assets of the central bank. But it's, I mean, I continuously argue against trying to find just one magic silver bullet. The most effective principle is all of the above. Creating multiple sources of pressure. I think the most important and unique feature of the current sanctions is the combination of two factors. First, sanctions introduced by the governments, and second, withdrawal of companies, which is not dictated by sanctions. It's voluntary in a lot of ways, because companies are obviously against what Putin is doing in Ukraine. So I think the combination of two, that's a very, very uncomfortable sandwich for Putin. So on top you have government sanctions, on the bottom you have companies withdrawal. So you are cut off from everything, as I said. Financial markets, markets of goods and services, logistics, insurance, technology, whatever, right? So no searching for a magic silver bullet, but combining and keeping the pressure, and new sanctions every week. Now, where's the EU is talking about the sixth package? Now, where is it? So new sanctions every week is much worse for Putin than just, you know, one big Tsar bomb of sanctions, you know. Now, on China, I would advise, again, I mentioned it, but I would advise to read my paper for the Wilfred Martin Center. It came out in November. It was called Ambitions Dashed: Why Sino-Russian Economic Cooperation is Not Working. One of the important features I outline is that a Russia-China relation is complicated. It has some extent of convergence of interests, essentially the collective defense of authoritarianism versus liberal democratic order. But then you go through differences, and they are huge. Competing interests, competing visions. I would say on surface, there are significant common interests in counterweighting Western democracies. If you scratch the surface, there are so much more, like competition in Central Asia. You asked about what Russian elite is thinking. They're absolutely angry about Chinese advances in Central Asia and influence over Central Asian governments. Just, you know, just imagine that great majority of Central Asian gas is flowing to China now. It's 10 times bigger than Russian exports of gas to China. And also Russia supplies gas at much cheaper price, about 30% cheaper than Turkmenistan. So all of them are outplaying us in Central Asia, and I mean many issues. Russians are particularly unhappy, you know, when they have all these Shanghai Cooperation Organization summits somewhere in Central Asia, and they arrive in the summit capital city, and the slogans across the city, the billboards, are in Chinese, not in Russian. Makes them really mad. So I would say, I do not know, I can only guess and somewhat speculate here, but my understanding is that it is only Putin and some very narrow inner circle, like Patrushev and some other guys, who are really invested in this idea that China will be our savior and best global buddy and partner. Majority of the rest of Russian elite is fearful of China, is well aware that we're essentially losing a competition to China in many ways, that we are no match, that China is so much bigger that there can be no such thing as equal partnership. Over time, they will simply swallow us, particularly if the current nature of relations is very disadvantageous for Russia, because Russia is very much weakened by everything that happened, and China is positioned to take advantage. Many people in the Russian elite realize that. So it's a complicated relationship, and I think people in the West should be aware of all these cracks in the pavement of all the weaknesses.
Okay, thank you. The lady in the second row.
Thank you very much, and also for the somewhat optimistic perspective you gave us. 5 days ago, a conference took place here by the Institute for Human Sciences, you may know it, with quite a number of distinguished scholars and experts, and one of them was Olivia Lazar, working for Carnegie Europe. She's a scholar at Carnegie Europe and right now also a fellow at the Institute here in Vienna. And she emphasized that this war in Ukraine, seen from the perspective of Putin, is also an attempt to further reduce the access of the West to rare material, raw material, rare earth, necessary for the energy transformation and in view of the climate change. She did some studies on the Wagner Group in the Congo Basin, you may know all this, but also in Ukraine we know that there are important resources of these materials. How do you see this analysis that Putin is trying? She didn't say that he would succeed, of course, but that he's trying with this war to further, as I said, limit or even cut off the access of the West to such strategically very important resources.
Listen, I would advise against oversimplification and narrowing down of what's happening towards some very, very practical issues. Like when we had the war in Chechnya in the 90s, a lot of people said it's all about Chechen oil, it's all about the pipeline which is transporting Caspian crude. It was much bigger than that. It was much bigger than that. So it is now. So yeah, I mean, there might be some, you know, additional components to what Putin is doing, some additional advantages as it seems to his mind and to the minds of his advisors, right, which might also include this. But generally I have to say the picture is much bigger than just some narrow practical interests in rare earth.
Okay, please no discussion. Okay.
But the conflict, it evolved over time. We saw how it evolved. We also, I think there's one simple exercise that might give you an idea that in Ukraine, Putin is going after something much bigger than just metals, rare earth. You track his comments about Ukraine over years. You see how much effort and attention he invested in Ukraine on, you know, various parts of it, being gas transit network, being security issues and placement of Russian troops, whatever. There were many aspects of it. This is a multi-dimensional thing. So, yeah, I understand that this is an important issue, but my point is that this whole war and aggression is about much bigger picture than just that.
Yeah. Please over here, Kettele and the neighbor.
Thank you very much for your very interesting...
Just a moment, the micro, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting perspectives. My name's Ron Willis. I tend to look at things a little bit from a New Zealand point of view.
Please louder, please.
I tend to look at things a little bit from a New Zealand point of view because that's where I come from. Couple of questions. One, is Russia totally self-sufficient on oil and gas extraction technology? Can they keep on producing a large volume without the big Western companies? Because when we look at all the big projects in Russia, they seem to have all been carried out with one of the big Western oil companies assisting. Second question is, it's an interesting question how to phrase this. Would President Putin be silly enough to unilaterally resort to the nuclear option?
Thank you very much. First, on self-sufficiency, no, Russia is definitely not self-sufficient. It can produce a lot of oil and gas. Particularly, this is more important related to oil than to natural gas, because a majority of Russian oil field stock is pretty matured, depleted. So a lot really depends on technology, of how do you enhance output. And that, the best technology is obviously controlled by Baker Hughes, Schlumberger, Halliburton. Their withdrawal, if it happens, because they did not make it fully clear what they're up to. If they withdraw, that will have a significant impact. I would say, if you want a rough estimate, like 30-40% of the output in matured Western Siberian fields, which is still the major producing region, is related to technologies that are brought by Americans. So that will be a very significant decline in productivity. Imagine they withdraw. There's no replacement. Russian technology, Chinese technologies is not a replacement for unique enhancement techniques that they possess. It's not going to be the end of the world, but the impact will be significant. And also costs will rise. What I'm saying, what I said about diverting oil and gas flows to Asia is that we will have less revenue and bigger cost. So that factor of withdrawal of Western technology companies also adds to the cost. So that further reduces profit. And profit is something which is useful, because if the industry is not so profitable, then what are we talking about? There will be no money for maintaining Putin's grip on power, for continuing the war, and so on. Now, on the nuclear option, listen, we gotta be a bit careful with forecasts after what he did on February 24th. Because I really believe that he would not launch this war. Because I specifically made these predictions that a Russian army will be weak, it will be not capable of capturing cities, and the urban warfare will cause great destruction and bloodshed of the magnitude that we haven't seen even in Sarajevo and Grozny. That Ukraine will resist, that was all visible. But Putin still went for it. It's another question why he did it. But we do not know. What we do know, several things. First, Russian elite is very much aware that if there's going to be an all-out nuclear war with the West, they're going to lose very quickly, and it will be the end. Proof, if you know Russian, Google Rogozin, Россия проиграет Америке войну за 6 часов. Russia will lose a war to America in 6 hours. 9 years ago, in 2013, Rogozin was so stupid to give a lecture, public lecture. He wanted to lobby for more money to beef up our strategic nuclear potential, right? So he essentially said that in a few hours, America will destroy 90% of our strategic nuclear potential with high-precision non-nuclear strikes. That was his point. So point number one, we do know that Russian elite is well aware that an all-out nuclear war means total loss in a very short period of time. Point number two, I do not see, many people discuss use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. I do not see much military sense in that. Maybe, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. If there is, I mean, let's discuss that. But the consequences for Russia will be horrific. That will be a red line for many people. it will only stimulate further very tough rounds of pressure from the international community, this time probably including the countries which so far refrain from going against Putin and participating in sanctions and so on. So downsides from using a tactical nuclear weapon, significant. Upsides, maybe Putin sees it, I just don't. So, I mean, let's be careful with forecasts here, but I see it still more as a blackmail option. But again, we got to be prepared for different scenarios. As with this war, preparedness is one way to guarantee proper response. If we're not prepared, then really some unexpected, terrible things might happen.
Okay, thank you. Neighbor.
Thank you very much. Lawrence Kettle, I'm an associate fellow with the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. First of all, thank you for your really in-depth insights. I think it's really, you raised some really excellent points there about how the YouTube channels, for example, more and more people in Russia are starting to see what's really happening, and you know, the dissent is building, and your analysis of that this could lead to the cracks that you were talking about in the structure. But there is something further to that, because I'm not going to ask you to make, you know, futuristic predictions. We know that in planning and strategic planning, it's, you know, that's not necessarily possible. But I would like to point out something about one of Vladimir Putin's personal idols, and that's Yuri Andropov. And to remind some people who might not be familiar with Soviet history of what happened in Hungary in 1956 when that same dissent and uprising started, he convinced Nikita Khrushchev to bring in the military and smash that resistance hard. Now, I completely agree with you. I want to make this very clear that we need to spread that message that Putin is lying to his population, and in order to really show the cracks. But what happens, because, you know, he's taken a leaf out of Yuri Andropov's book several times. What happens if he does it again? And do you think that's a possibility? Or do you really believe that, as you quoted in your CNN interview, his days are actually numbered? Thank you.
When he really feels the danger, he will shoot. No question about it. This is actually the reason. People asking why Russians are not protesting. Because of this. Because we saw what happened in Kazakhstan in January, also with the participation of Russian troops. We saw what happened in Belarus since 2020. We have been shot. And we know, people are actually well aware. Well, we had several rounds of imprisonment of people for protesting, like Bolotnaya, which happened 10 years ago, and then the Moscow case in 2019 after Moscow elections. Unfortunately, I have to say that all of the people who got real prison terms for participation in that protest, their lives were broken. They came out broken. Even some of them, Sergei Makhnatkin had died after injuries he sustained in prison. So yes, he will shoot. Yes, he will shoot. Point is that when the population turns up against him, first, this will be some sort of flood that he will no longer be able to contain with just shooting, right? That will be okay. People will calm down for a while, but they will never again fall in love with him and never support what he's doing. And this is what I've been explaining earlier on. When they will just simply wait when the system weakens enough for them to come back. This is what's going to happen. So we need to weaken the system for the people to come back. And second, this is actually why still repressions in a lot of ways are targeted, because it has a backfiring boomerang effect. if you go extreme cruelty, that ruins your public support. People don't like that. This is what I called in the '93 effect. In a standoff between Yeltsin and Supreme Soviet, most people supported Yeltsin. Particularly in Moscow, 80 to 20% supported Yeltsin. But the shooting, people said, no, sorry, we didn't order that. Boris, we were with you, but that it came to, I mean, so far as this, we do not approve that. Which is why immediately after the shooting, Yeltsin lost support in parliament. 93 Duma elections brought the opposition to a majority and so on. So that is sort of similar. They are really well aware. Again, it's important that they carefully monitor public opinion, and they do have constraints in this regard, which will not stop them from shooting once they really feel life-threatening danger, right? But this will not stop the course of history. So it will only hold certain events, but once the flood is there, I mean, eventually, this is what I meant in my CNN interview. Right now, I think it's much more realistic to speak about the end of the regime as ever before, because without such a stress as caused by this war, it could have lingered on for like an indefinite period. No indefinite period now. We're only testing the limits of how much he can hold on with such enormous stress that was created.
Yeah, maybe a question from my side. One of the aspects also was, protests coming from soldiers' mothers. As far as we know, what is estimated at the moment, around about 15,000, 20,000 soldiers died. And usually you have around about 4 times as many wounded people. So you could say around about 50,000 damaged people, wounded soldiers are already there. Do you think that this could have an effect that, I mean, the relatives, the mothers, the fathers could go into a phase of strong protest?
It's complicated because I would strongly advise you to look at this. There was a map produced, I don't remember by whom, but it's widely circulating. There was a map of casualties distributed by the Russian regions. And there's an amazing overlap with poverty. They don't send people from Moscow, Petersburg, and big cities into heavy combat. People from really very poor regions go, where there's a significantly less value of life. If you see the interviews of the relatives, listen, this is one of the most unimaginable moments that drives me crazy. Because journalists talk to them, their son, husband, relative was killed, and they say, well, maybe this was necessary, because the government sent him there, then it means it was necessary. So he might have he might have died for some just cause. And the question is, what is the cause? What the hell was the purpose of him going there? We don't know, but the government must know better. And the relative just died. I mean, this is, but this really, there's a correlation because they know. They just do not send, many soldiers and officers from big urban areas in this regard. So I think, again, if you look at the opinion polling, the biggest factor which will drive the popular negativity would still be economy and deterioration of living standards, and the fact that we are into a prolonged conflict. Because the people were initially convinced by television that this thing's going to end up very soon and victoriously. Nobody wants a prolonged, troubled, bloody conflict. There's zero demand for that, even among the hardline Putin supporters. So I would rather say that these factors will be the most important driving the further protests.
Okay, yeah, yes, over there, the lady.
Levada Center has published results of a survey showing that 80% of adult Russians support Putin. It was like 2 months ago, I guess. What do you think? How did it develop in the meantime? At which number are we now in Russia?
You're quoting the poll which was published at the end of March. There was another one at the end of April. So few things. Again, I mentioned that in my introductory speech. In that same poll, only 29 people said that they watch events closely, events around Ukraine. Then there was a division. They asked people not just do you support or not. They said, do you firmly support unconditionally or more support than oppose? So there was always this, about a third of people in every age group, which is included in the 80%, but support is conditional. They say more support, which means that for some reasons they support it, but it can change quickly. And it happened during a month because the solid support, definitely yes. In that March poll which you're quoting was 53%. And it declined to 45 by end April. Now, another important thing is that there are many, I can go into details if you like, but the bottom line is that pollsters have identified by different methods that about 10–15% of the respondents refuse to answer the question honestly. Do you support the war or not? Special operation, as they say it. And about 90% of those people who refuse to answer are against the war. Meaning that when you have 53 solid support, according to Levada poll, given that 10–15% delta, it means that it's below 50 already. And if it's 45, that means it's closer to 30. So that means it's not too much. Dynamic is very bad for Putin. If it goes that pace, by the fall of this year, all support will be gone. Collapse is pretty remarkable. There is another poll which was done by, that is probably more important because there was not a poll which asked the people a question head on, do you support the war or not? That was a poll done by Group M, the international advertising company, which asked people a question, which media source do you trust most? Television, internet, news websites, or social media. So in mid-March, television led by 33% as a dominating, trustful source of information. It collapsed to 23% by end April, leveling off with social media, which also grew to 23%. Also, according to recent Levada poll, YouTube, for the first time ever, had surged to 45% as a major source of information for the Russians. That is remarkable. If these dynamics continue, I mean, in few months' time, there will be little left of what is called support for the war. So what is important about the polling are the nuances. If you're interested, I can email you the link to my article in English about that, which I published recently, explaining all these different polling nuances. So when you mention the 80% figure, it is generally correct, but there are many nuances about that, which we should not forget about.
Okay. Dr. Haider.
First, I want to thank you for your excellent presentation. One point, which role do you think the Russian Church, the Orthodox Church, plays also in relation to its role which it has in the Ukraine? And the other thing which was striking for me when you speak about Russia, you speak about us and not about them, even you are here. So how do you feel as a Russian in such a situation, and how do Russians like you in generally feel? Because you must have some kind of wish to get your country out of this dilemma.
Listen, I feel encouraged. I left Russia in March 2021. And I was living in a standard residential neighborhood, walking around with my son, my dog, going to same grocery stores. It was one of the third most populous district in Moscow, Yasenevo. And I mean, I couldn't move 10, 15 meters without being approached by somebody who was thanking me for everything that the opposition was doing, saying how much they support us, even asking for a selfie or an audio. That is, you can see it on the internet. There was like thriving, plentiful selfies with myself around. And I only had, in all these years, I had like a couple of people approaching me saying, "You're a goddamn liberal on Western payroll," like 3 times most. But sympathizers all the time. I even had a story when I was speaking in Baltisk, which is a Russian naval base in Kaliningrad Oblast. And we were speaking on this semi-island, which is nearing the Polish border. There's some resort in there. And then we were shipped back to the main embankment to wait for a taxi. And somebody, some resident of Baltisk, was jogging on the embankment early morning. And there was this big Navy ships and so on. And he stops and says, "Oh, you're Milov. I'm watching you on YouTube all the time. I wanted to say thank you." So right now, we receive enormous feedback from across the country. Like, you know, my personal feedback is like about 250, 300 cities across the country, which is just the emails and messages that I read. Hate mail from Putin supporters, thin. I receive it also, but very marginal. So I can sort of more or less judge what is the temperature inside the society, which when I say we, I know that we have much better understanding with all these people than Putin's government. We did a lot of campaigning in the past few years, and listen, the one big difference with all these previous periods, 80s, 90s that I remember, is that everybody in the country, including the very Putin supporters, they are very well aware that, like, unlike any other period in Russian history, government and government-related oligarchy has a lot of money out there somewhere in their castles behind barbed wire. But this money is not for them, ordinary folks. And that is the system. That is actually very well understood by everybody in Russia. So this is why when I say we, it's really very easy to actually draw this parallel and to reach out to ordinary folks who are really watching us in big numbers. This is why we do not identify ourselves as the marginal minority. No, we can win the majority. And sorry, what was the first part of the question? Church. I think the role of the church in the society is greatly exaggerated. I would offer you several criteria. First, attendance of churches on holidays, Christmas and Easter. There is a very funny argument going on every year between the Russian Ministry of Interior and Russian Orthodox Church. Ministry of Interior usually says like 3 to 5 million people attended church holiday celebrations in churches. And the Russian Orthodox Church says, well, how can you say that? This is offensive. Such a small number. It was 6 to 7 million, which is still a fragment of the Russian population. If you take a look at some polls, like Pew Research did a very good poll, international poll, on the importance of religion in daily lives of the people. Russia, less than 20% say that religion is very important in their daily life. Anything like about 10 years ago, Russian Orthodox Church managed to get introduced in schools. They introduced a specific topic, studying the basics of Orthodoxy. But there was a big public outcry, so they did it not as a mandatory, but parents had to choose between basics of Orthodoxy, basics of Islam, Buddhism, and secular ethics. Guess which course was chosen the most in cities, in urban areas? Secular ethics. Many, I can go on for hours. So yeah, church has some importance in like cementing this whole notion of traditional values. It's just one more of the line of traditional values which make people numb. You cannot revolt because this is a tradition, has been there for ages. And tradition this, tradition that, including the church, right? As a separate entity, it's not that overly influential. I would say its influence is limited, but on elderly generation, which is the most consciously supportive of Putin and the war, church is an important factor, unlike the youth, where its influence is, I would say, negligible.
Okay, yeah, and this is also the last question, then I finish the list, please.
The last question of regarding the religion, when you were talking about the Orthodox Church, and there are some, let's say, some opinions that Putin has a very strong relationship to the Russian Orthodox Church, and the problem was this autokephalia with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Do you think this was one of the drivers why Putin wanted to get Ukraine back also under the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and he was arguing in a way that he had a very much strong interest in returning the Ukrainian Church back to the Russian Orthodox Church? This was one question. The other question was, when you talk about the big movement or the expected movement that the Russian population will once have the feeling to go on the streets and demonstrate, how long does it take until Putin's police is able to put them all down and to destroy all these demonstrations?
Well, I think I already answered this question. We discussed this about whether Putin will be inclined to shooting people. Yes, he will. Yes, he will be. Which means that there is, if some demonstrations are premature, if they take place before the government substantially weakens, then it might get really bloody and messy. Which is my prediction is that the strongest demonstrations will happen once the regime weakens significantly, and it will be publicly visible. That it cannot do anything about the war, about the economy, about China, about Russia's positions in the world, and people will sort of start to openly question it, like, what is this thing all about? Where are we going? So the less self-confident the regime will be, I think the shyer the response will be. More self-confidence, more brutality and suppression. I think the correlation is like this. Now, on an Orthodox Church story, again, as with the rare earth and metals, I would advise against a bit narrowing it down. By the time the churches have separated, we were already worlds apart, Russia and Ukraine. This was just an added component, maybe, but Putin was already very angry with the fact that after the spring of 2014, Putin was extremely angry, and he actually fired a lot of people who were specifically responsible for that project. He believed that once an outright pro-Western government would come to power in Kiev, that this whole greater east and south of Ukraine, mostly Russian-speaking, would tend to break away and separate and say, we don't want this, we will go back to Russia. He genuinely believed in that crap, which his ideological advisors have been feeding him. He was absolutely angry and mad when this did not happen. And this was far more important than the Orthodox Church issue. Now, on the matter of influence, in terms of what influences Putin, he's a cherry picker. He's influenced by stuff that he likes. So it's not that the Orthodox Church is that influences him, because we also see within the Russian Orthodox Church, on the bottom level, there is also a visible anti-war movement. You have a lot of news about priests actually speaking out and even being expelled because of their anti-war position. But Putin doesn't listen to those. He listens only to a very narrow, dark-minded ultra-conservatives like Shevkunov, because he simply likes what they say. So they can be from any church, not particularly Orthodox. If he likes what they say, then, you know, he's also been visiting the Buddhist temples together with Shoigu in eastern Siberia. He's absolutely not. As long as they say what he likes to hear, that's his universal religion, I would put it this way.
Okay. Okay, yeah, then. Thank you so much. I think we have not only got a lesson, you know, about what is going on, especially behind the scene. We got so many insights into Russian politics and relations. I would say it was not only knowledge, but it was a lot of wisdom behind it. And insofar, I also would like to ask a very last question concerning the relations between European people, between us and the Russian people. Because the war always has, of course, the tendency that people would try, you know, to assemble behind their nation, behind their leader and so on. And therefore my question, what can we do? What do we have to do in order not to alienate the Russian people too far from our people, not to alienate the people's hearts, but make it what it is, Putin's war, not more and not less?
That's a very important question, and several things. First, I think we actually need not to be shy, and we are not shy about speaking openly to the Russian people and actually bringing them to realize what kind of harm and destruction and horrible things Russia as a nation has been doing in Ukraine. We need to have this honest debate in the Russian society. So you also need to understand that we're not trying to sort of cover ourselves like, listen, it's all Putin, but we are good Russians. No, it's more complicated. So we need to have this honest soul searching in the Russian society, similar as Germany did after the Second World War. But we are absolutely encouraged by the number of highly knowledgeable people in European politics and expert community who are absolutely aware of all the troubles and complicated things that Russian society has been going through, who still do not lose hope for a normal democratic Russia. I think the best example in this regard is my friend Andrius Kubilius, the former Prime Minister of Lithuania. He's a member of European Parliament now, and he established an inter-party caucus called Friends of European Russia, specifically promoting the idea that Russia not only can, but will indeed be normal and democratic back again, and we need to encourage that and work with it and cooperate. We have multiple different projects. starting from enlightenment and educational programs to assisting the free voices who continue to speak and broadcast to the Russian people and changing the public opinion, to like multiple issues that they're also doing a lot of good online discussions and then offline discussions about important things. But it's very encouraging to see that many people in Europe actually realize that yes, we do have a democratic future. That also it's a matter of doing this with our own hands. We're not asking anybody to do this job for us. But there are very clear dimensions where Europeans can help, can encourage us and offer moral support to Russians who denounce Putinism, denounce aggression, denounce war, and this whole notion of like Russian exclusivity and zones of influence and so on. There are many people like that, and they should be encouraged in their aspirations for European future and normality. Thank you for doing that. And this is not something that we're talking should emerge from scratch. A lot is already being done, and this will be fruitful efforts. Russia, despite all that is happening right now, Russia will be back on track, and it will go through a very painful reckoning of what has happened. This is our big internal problem, but we have to go through it. But we will be back on track, and I wanted to thank many Europeans who understand that and who show solidarity with us in this dark moment. This is, of course, the ones who are really suffering now are Ukrainians, and we fully support their struggle. But it's important to understand that we were under attack long before, ever since Putin came to power. And he gradually transformed Russian society into this monster that we never imagined that could possibly happen. So again, thank you for your solidarity and your vision of a better future for all of us. Thank you.
Yeah.